Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media, while we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum. I remain in the underclass. Act 1, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's play The Tempest. The spirit Ariel wields chaos magic to form a tempest, causing a shipwreck, which forces the character Ferdinand to abandon ship. And as he leapt from the ship, he cried out, "Hell is empty, and all the devils are here." This week, we finally realized there is no real distinction between intelligence agencies such as the CIA or Mossad, MI5, MI6, British or French intelligence, and the shadow cabal of global elites hiding behind the curtain as puppet masters pulling the strings. These people don't recognize national borders. Generally speaking, in terms of American intelligence, it really is one whole perverse network that leads into the other. From royal families to secret societies, paramilitary groups, and underground cult organizations, these entities perfectly embody the malignant cancer disrupting all of global society. There is a global intelligence apparatus operating as a private army with the only goal of enforcing the secret agenda of the international aristocracy. In our effort to peel back the disturbing layers of deceit intended to thoroughly disguise this alarmingly distinct modus operandi, we reluctantly reveal yet another dark and lurid tale of abuse and betrayal, invoking a haunting sense of déjà vu. Only this is no illusion of memory, but a terrifying vista of reality and of our frightful position therein. Corrupt legal inquiries, covert psychological operations, state-run child brothels exploited for purposes of political blackmail, a UK Ministry of Defense program of psychological conditioning to create submissive boy soldiers, and mounting evidence tied to numerous allegations of satanic ritual abuse. The story of the Kincora Boys' Home shares all the hallmarks implicating this untouchable clandestine power structure hidden behind the shadowy veil and shrouded in mystery. In order to better understand the violent and chaotic environment providing the unique wartime conditions and setting the stage for this heartrending story, it's important for us to briefly cover the political landscape of Northern Ireland at this time. Civil unrest and domestic violence had become commonplace. Northern Ireland was created in 1921 when Ireland was partitioned by the Parliament of the United Kingdom, dividing Ireland into two separate self-governing polities, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. According to the book Making Sense of the Troubles, as was intended by Unionists and their supporters in Westminster, Northern Ireland had a Unionist majority who wanted to remain in the United Kingdom. They were generally the Protestant descendants of colonists from Britain. Meanwhile, the majority in Southern Ireland and a significant minority in Northern Ireland were Irish nationalists, generally Catholics, who wanted a united independent Ireland. Southern Ireland became the Irish Free State in 1922 under the Anglo-Irish Treaty, ending the 3-year Irish War of Independence between the Irish Republic, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, and British Crown forces. The Free State was established as a dominion of the British Empire. It comprised 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland. Northern Ireland, which was made up of the remaining 6 counties, exercised its right under the treaty to opt out of the new state. The Unionists generally see themselves as British, while the Nationalists clearly saw themselves as Irish, with a significant minority from all backgrounds claiming a Northern Irish or Ulster identity. Ulster is one of the four traditional or historic Irish provinces. Robert Lynch, in the Cambridge University Press, explains that the creation of Northern Ireland was accompanied by violence, both in defense of and against partition. During the conflict of 1920 to 1922, the capital Belfast saw major communal violence, mainly between Protestant Unionist and Catholic Nationalist civilians. More than 500 were killed, and more than 10,000 became refugees, mostly Catholics. According to authors David McKittrick and David McVeigh, for the next 50 years, Northern Ireland had an unbroken series of Unionist Party governments. There was informal mutual segregation by both communities, and the Unionist governments were accused of discrimination against the Irish nationalist and Catholic minority. What has been described as the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland began in the late 1960s as a campaign to end discrimination against Catholics and nationalists, but was largely opposed by loyalists who saw it as a Republican front. Loyalists support the continued existence of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom and oppose a united Ireland independent of the UK. This unrest sparked the Troubles, a 30-year conflict involving Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries and state forces, which claimed over 3,500 lives and injured at least 50,000 others. The 1998 Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, was considered to be a major step in the peace process, including paramilitary disarmament and security normalization. This brief background of Northern Ireland perfectly illustrates the environment of chaos and violence which is only befitting a story such as this. A disconcerting tragedy, revealing the widespread cognitive distortions which accurately reflect the flawed perception of reality embraced by the significant majority. The Kincora Boys' Home in East Belfast, Northern Ireland, was opened in 1958 by the local health authority. The purpose of the institution was to provide full-time accommodation for boys who faced an abusive or otherwise compromised home life. Kincora was at the center of a major scandal in 1980 surrounding serious organized child sexual abuse, which led to an attempted cover-up with allegations of state collusion. Our story begins January 24th, 1980, when a news report was published in the Irish Independent with the title, "Fit to Raise Cover-Up in Westminster, Sex Racket at Children's Home." According to the article, a major scandal erupted in Northern Ireland last night on allegations of an official cover-up over the recruiting of boys at a Belfast children's home for homosexual prostitution. The matter is to be raised at Westminster by Independent MP Gerry Fitt, who was shocked to the core by the reports. If these allegations are true, there has been some kind of Watergate cover-up, and those responsible should be brought to book. The shocking allegations about the home on the outskirts of the city resulted in a police report being sent to the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, but no action was taken, and reports on certain cases were destroyed under orders from a senior member of the Social Services Department, it is claimed. A member of the staff at the boys' home is alleged to be involved with a loyalist paramilitary group. Officials in the health department were told this, but he has retained his job, despite being suspected of encouraging children to engage in homosexual acts for money and accepting payments for pimping. The police reports name a number of important Northern Ireland businessmen as being involved. So far, one of the children involved is alleged to have committed suicide, and another, now living with an elderly homosexual, is said to have attempted suicide as well. Mr. Fitz said, "I am prepared to raise the matter at Westminster and call for a full inquiry." The situation first came to light in 1977. One boy, who knew of the child prostitution, is said not to have received any support from social workers when he faced a criminal charge, because it was thought advisable to have him locked up where he could not talk. Files on the allegations currently exist in 2 police stations, Strandtown and Donegal Pass, Belfast. A detective at the Strandtown station is understood to have conducted an intensive investigation of the boys' home and the staff member under suspicion, and to have worked on the report which was sent to the DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions. A number of people with vital information are ironically forbidden under the Official Secrets Act from revealing what they know about the crimes and the official cover-up. Since the police inquiry, 2 justices of the peace in Belfast have continued to send boys to the home. Children at the center range from 10 to 17. Some of the alleged offenses are claimed to have involved boys as young as 12. Last night, a reliable source claimed that the man suspected of having made large amounts of money by hiring out teenage boys still held a senior position at the home. It was reported that no prosecution had taken place, despite allegations of abuse first surfacing in 1977 in the Royal Ulster Constabulary RUC at Belfast, Strandtown, and Donegal Pass stations, giving the Director of Public Prosecutions a report detailing allegations of boys being sexually abused and prostituted, and even naming prominent businessmen as being involved. On April 3, 1980, 3 members of staff at the home, William McGrath, Raymond Semple, and Joseph Maines, were charged with a number of offenses relating to the systematic sexual abuse of children in their care over a number of years. They were all convicted. Maines, who had been the warden, was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. Semple, an assistant warden, to 5 years, and McGrath was jailed in December 1981 for only 4 years. Allegations were later made that the RUC had been informed of the abuse at the home for years previously, but had not moved to prevent it. In his 1999 book, The Dirty War, Martin Dillon claims that McGrath, who was also the leader of an obscure loyalist paramilitary group called Tara, may have been employed by MI5 since the 1960s and was being blackmailed into providing intelligence on other loyalist groups. Investigative journalist Niall O'Dowd claims that Ian Paisley, leader of the Democratic Unionist Party and moderator of the Free Presbyterian Church, which he founded in 1951, was accused of failing to report McGrath's abuse to the relevant authorities. He initially denied ever being advised by his informant, a church member Valerie Shaw, that it was taking place. Paisley later gave other versions acknowledging learning from Shaw about McGrath's homosexuality. During this time, it was alleged by current affairs magazine Private Eye that high-ranking members of the Whitehall Civil Service and senior officers of the British military were involved in the sexual abuse of boys in Kincora. Welcome to the Kincora Boys' Home, an Orwellian child abuse nightmare.
It's so horrific. The person who would commit an act like this would have to be an extremely callous, brutal, cold individual who had no feeling for his victim. What would stop the ordinary person committing an act like this would be that he would feel sorry and have pity. But an individual like this would have no feeling, and in fact might almost get some pleasure or perverted excitement or thrill out of an act like this.
It is easy to look back with hindsight now and say what should or could or really must have been done.
Thomas Spence, who was 11, and 13-year-old John Rogers disappeared in November
John
1974.
Waiting for a school bus on the Falls Road.
Thomas and John did not arrive at school that morning.
Somewhere, some person knows something that could help in our investigations.
Is this a Protestant Catholic thing with our loyalists involved in this? Troubles unleashed some awful, deep-seated hatreds within the society itself.
The police were particularly unfriendly to the people of that district at that time.
There's no doubt about it. The police have questions to answer here.
People were making up their own stories, if you ask me.
These boys have been forgotten about.
Until somebody pokes the hive with a stick, nothing will be done.
It was a scandal which has been described as Northern Ireland's Watergate.
There was a culture in Northern Ireland of the abuse of young boys.
One of the growing questions, exactly what part did British intelligence play in this saga?
Pedophiles weren't a priority for intelligence special branch elements because they were assets.
The lack of evidence, the lack of investigation, what the hell went on here?
Was there a deliberate cover-up? The investigations seem to have been either scant or deliberately limited.
The real issue at stake in this matter are those young lives which were blighted because of organised thuggery.
This will not go away. There is no hiding place.
Any attempt to get the police involved in Kincora was resisted by MI5.
The files were all destroyed. The question arises, who authorised the destruction of those files?
This kind of thing happened, and people just don't understand that it happened, but it did.
This went right to the top. It had to.
Kincora Boys' Home took in youngsters and teenagers from the courts or who were thought to be in moral danger. There have been allegations of homosexual offences here for over 20 years. But it was only last December that Mr. William McGrath, a prominent Orangeman and a house father at Kincora, was jailed for 4 years for sexual offences against boys in his care. 4 other men were also jailed. A former missionary of Dr. Paisley's church accused the DUP leader of not taking action against McGrath 8 years before he was brought to trial.
I approached Dr. Paisley on at least 7 occasions. I asked him time and time again what he intended to do about this. My concern all along was very much for the fact that there were young boys under the threat of this man's corruption.
Dr. Paisley has been calling for an immediate public judicial inquiry. He admits Miss Shaw did tell him of McGrath's homosexuality, but not that he worked at Kincora.
What she said, yes, she did say she made accusations against Mr. McGrath, and she based these on the evidence of a Mr. X. When I met Mr. X, he wouldn't meet Mr. McGrath. And I, of course, did the only thing I could do. I put Mr. McGrath from taking part in an orange service in my church. He wasn't a member of my church, but I certainly took that discipline immediately. And I regret that Miss Shaw didn't go to the police.
But Miss Shaw says she did, and the police too have been accused of a cover-up. There have been several police inquiries into alleged homosexual prostitution rings which catered for prominent Ulstermen, but most of the investigations were apparently dropped. Now the RUC's tough Chief Constable, Sir John Herman, is making sure there's been no cover-up. He's called in an outsider to investigate the allegations against some of his men and to take charge of any fresh inquiries. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Mr. Pryor, set up a committee of inquiry to sit in private. But last week, 3 of the 5 committee members resigned because they felt they couldn't do the job the public wanted to find out exactly what had gone on in Kincora. It was clear Mr. Pryor had seriously underestimated public concern. But it remains to be seen whether his announcement today and a fresh investigation by an independent Chief Constable will satisfy that concern. David Rose, News at 10, Belfast.
They were abused as children. Now these middle-aged men believe this is their last chance to unravel what they allege is a cover-up by security services going back decades. A High Court bid to investigate the real story of Kincora Boys' Home. Not here in Belfast, but in London, and the UK inquiry chaired by Justice Goddard.
This has to go to the top. It has to go to Westminster.
Westminster has the authority, they have the power, and they have most of the documents.
I just can't even get a night's sleep. It's just always in my head, things that's happened to me.
In 1981, 3 senior staff at Kincora were convicted of sexually abusing 11 boys in their care. Joseph Mains, his assistant Raymond Semple, and the housefather William McGrath, the leader of an extreme loyalist movement called Tara.
But attempts to establish the truth about British state collusion and what went on here have so far been blocked. It's been persistently alleged that William McGrath was an informant for British intelligence. But after 2 judge-led inquiries, MI5's involvement is still unclear.
There were complaints about Kincora from as early as 1967, but the scandal didn't unravel until 1980.
I was just thinking of the other boys too.
Richard Kerr and other survivors are adamant the current historical abuse inquiry in Northern Ireland will not uncover what really went on inside these walls. Led by Sir Anthony Hart, it lacks the powers to force MI5 to hand over documents and cannot compel witnesses to testify. Colin Wallace is a former Army intelligence officer who blew the whistle more than 40 years ago. He, like the victims, are pushing for Kincora to be brought into the Westminster inquiry, something the Home Affairs Committee have also called for. He spent years trying to raise the alarm, speaking to his superiors, the press, but was cast as a fanciful Walter Mitty character. Time and time again, Parliament said they had no evidence that abuse was taking place in Kincora, but his warnings went to the very top.
This document was the...
Tonight, he reveals a letter he sent to Margaret Thatcher as late as 1990.
I think what information we did have in the 1970s was more than adequate to have brought a prosecution. I just find it so hard to believe why somewhere along the line the amazing security apparatus that we had in Northern Ireland in 1974, and it was really comprehensive, all the different agencies, why they failed to intervene to stop that at any point during those years.
In the 1970s, he was a rising star. Here he sits alongside Terence O'Neill, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Officially, he was a senior information officer in the MOD, but he was also working as a member of the ultra-secret Army Psychological Operations Unit, attempting to control and infiltrate paramilitary groups. That led him to Kincora. In 1973, he briefed journalists in the hope they would start investigating, but it didn't work. The following year, increasingly exasperated, the army and police were aware of the abuse claims, but nothing was being done. He sent a memo to his superiors, appealing to them to take action. Dated the 8th of November 1974, it reads,
I find it very difficult to accept that the RUC consistently failed to take action on such serious allegations unless they had specifically received some form of policy direction. Such direction could only have come from a very high political or police level. If the allegations are true, then we should do everything possible to ensure that the situation is not allowed to continue. The youngsters in these hostels almost certainly come from problem families, and it is clear that no one will fight in their corner unless we do.
Well, bearing in mind we're dealing with the army and the police, they themselves had a lot of authority. It is virtually impossible for any organisation to stop a chief constable or indeed a senior police officer from doing their duty. And I can only conclude, therefore, that whoever did stop action being taken had to have considerably more power. And in the context of Northern Ireland, that must have been from London. I can think of no one in Northern Ireland who had that level of authority.
Colin was vilified, discredited and wrongly jailed for manslaughter. The conviction was later quashed. He always maintained he had told the authorities boys were being abused from the early 1970s, but those allegations were dismissed. Then, in 1990, Margaret Thatcher admitted that her government had misled Parliament and the public about Wallace's role, but she didn't address the issue of child abuse. A few months later,
he wrote this letter, shared with Channel 4 News for the first time.
Instead of the positive response promised by ministers, each of my letters has been fobbed off with absurd excuses. Despite the assurances given to Parliament that previous errors in ministerial statements have been corrected, the government is still misleading the House over those issues.
Just months after Colin left Northern Ireland, this man, Richard Kerr, now living in America, entered Kincora. Colin says if his warnings were acted on, Richard and many other boys could have been saved from years of sexual abuse. It took 7 years since he first raised the alarm for the home to close.
Richard has lived here for more than 20 years, but it's only really in the past 12 months that he's found the strength to speak out about what happened to him in his early life. He says he feels safer in Dallas, but he's still very anxious at this stage to reveal all.
He came here hoping to start afresh. The shadow of the Kincora scandal, though, still rests heavy on him.
I'm angry at the authority figures, the people above them, knowing that this was going on. That's where my anger is. To those who turned a blind eye, to those children and me. Turned a blind eye because they believed they could get away with it.
Have you received specific threats about speaking out?
I received threats back in 1980 and 1979. Reliable sources are telling me that I need to stop talking.
Despite the fact Colin's career and life were destroyed for many years, he says he doesn't regret what he tried to expose.
I genuinely believe I did my best, but I also feel very sad that I wasn't able to do more. My job, don't forget, was helping to fight terrorism. Kincora was a small but fairly stressful sideline, and I found it frustrating more than anything else because it should have been very easy to resolve, and I suppose I still grates with me that we weren't able to do more than we did do.
He became one of the biggest whistleblowers of his generation. Like the victims, he firmly believes this is the last opportunity to establish if there was an MI5 cover-up that allowed boys to be abused in Kincora to protect intelligence.
I've been through life with not trusting anybody. I don't get involved with anybody. That is why I'm 57, never been married, no children. And that is, I'm just an ordinary guy. I wanted the same things that everybody else had, and I just had to look at it from outside.
What would you say to those looking on in Westminster today?
Let us have our day in the sunshine. You know, we're getting old, so draw a line under this.
And if a line isn't drawn, they fear they could remain on the outside, the state's alleged role in their troubled past covered up forever.
Village magazine, Ireland's political and cultural magazine, published an article effectively explaining this morally abhorrent scandal by starting out with one single point: a honey trap baited with children. Put simply, MI6, MI5, and the RUC Special Branch ran Kincora and other homes as honey traps to ensnare and blackmail unionist politicians and paramilitaries who abused children. Kincora is arguably the worst scandal of the entire Troubles. Children were abused for decades at a variety of care homes in Portora Royal College. The abuse was organized by Stormont civil servants and politicians such as Joss Cardwell, MP, as well as by figures at the level of local authority, and by court officials such as Ken Lamore. Phil Mains, the warden of Kincora, was close to loyalist terrorists such as John McKeague. William McGrath was placed in the home as housefather in June of 1971, most likely by Sir Maurice Oldfield of MI6. McGrath was close to Loyalist politician and future First Minister of Northern Ireland Ian Paisley. The UVF, Ulster Volunteer Force, an Ulster Loyalist militant group, and UDA, Ulster Defence Association, considered to be a paramilitary terrorist group. He was also an arms smuggler and commander of Tara, yet another paramilitary group. Mains and McGrath trafficked the boys to Loyalist terrorists and politicians. MI5 recorded sex sessions at the Park Avenue Hotel in Belfast and elsewhere. The RUC Special Branch protected these operations. Loyalist killers were recruited via blackmail to murder on behalf of MI5, and politicians were compromised. VIPs such as Lord Mountbatten and other VIPs such as James Molyneux, MP, enjoyed access to a steady supply of vulnerable children. Hence, we have child abuse, blackmail, perversion of the course of justice, state sponsorship of terrorism, gun running, state malfeasance, and murder, all rolled up into one compound of evil. It's important to at least dedicate a small segment of this story to child psychiatrist Dr. Roderick Morrison Fraser, referred to by some as the Demon Doctor. According to the Belfast Telegraph, Belfast doctor, who was a convicted pedophile, was allowed to continue working with children due to a number of failings by the authorities. Dr. Niall Meehan, head of the Journalism and Media Communications faculty at Griffith College, Dublin, found that the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, was made aware in 1971 Royal Hospital Belfast child psychiatrist Dr. Roderick Morrison Fraser had abused a 13-year-old Belfast boy in London. He pled guilty to the offences the following year, but he was not jailed, and he was allowed to continue to work with children. The report, entitled Child Abuse, Corruption and Collusion in Britain and Northern Ireland, claims that following a series of cover-ups by the authorities, Fraser was able to remain on the medical register even after he was convicted of child abuse again in 1974. Throughout the next 20 years, Fraser used his professional status in Britain to rebuild his profile, to gain access to children, and to facilitate assaults by fellow predatory pedophiles Peter Wrighton and Charles Napier. Richard Kerr, who was around 13 at the time, claims that he was abused by Fraser during counseling at the doctor's medical offices in Belfast Royal Hospital in the early 1970s. He said, "Morris abused me in his office 2 or 3 times on those visits. I will never forget that face, that black hair. I have never forgotten it." 2 years later, Mr. Kerr was sent to Kincora Boys' Home, which was at the center of an abuse scandal in 1980. Mr. Kerr said that Fraser had access to all of the children's homes in Belfast. Dr. Meehan comments, security services and the doctor's professional body, the General Medical Council, GMC, played a collusive and possibly corrupt role in the Fraser saga. That role, apparently in 1973, could have been exposed by alert journalists. Had they done so, it is possible that abuse in children's homes in Northern Ireland might have been revealed sooner. Children could have been saved years of abuse by Fraser and his associates. Fraser was jailed for possessing and distributing child pornography in 1992, but it was not until 1995 that he voluntarily stopped being a doctor. Dr. Meehan said, "This is perhaps most importantly a story that refocuses attention on state responsibility for the abuse of children in Northern Ireland during the early 1970s. It is clear from this investigation that official protection of abusers and abuse for intelligence purposes spread wider than merely the fringes of unionist politics. The lid on this can of worms should be fully pried open." It appears that current inquiries into child abuse in both Britain and Northern Ireland are designed to exclude such matters. If that is so, what is their point? It is understood a Freedom of Information request regarding Fraser was turned down in 2015 for reasons of national security. Another anomaly comes in the form of the most senior legal officer in Great Britain, the Attorney General Lord Patrick Mayhew, and former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland between 1992 and 1997. Lord Patrick Mayhew was actually present at the General Medical Council's disciplinary hearing of convicted pedophile and child psychiatrist Dr. Maurice Fraser, and even made representations on his behalf. A more recent report placed Dr. Maurice Fraser as living as a free man in the Netherlands, escaping any real accountability to a country that essentially considers child pornography as legal, while operating what is in effect an age of consent of 12 years old, subject to qualifications. In 2015, an academic study revealed files regarding Dr. Maurice Fraser and his potential connections to British intelligence, which the British state was unwilling to release on grounds of national security. Beyond being used in human honey trap operations, various survivors have even alleged that they were a part of a UK Ministry of Defence program of psychological conditioning to create boy soldiers. From a young age, these children were being conditioned and groomed as intelligence operatives used to compromise prominent people. One victim even mentioned a technique known as the elevator trick, which they had allegedly performed at a particular hotel known as the Europa in Belfast. It was there they were told to wait for a prominent person on the floor of their room as they leave to access the elevator, take the elevator to the ground floor with them, and as they exit, walk out next to them or slightly bump into them, and British intelligence would have a blackmail photographer waiting to capture a photograph of them standing next to this child prostitute. The photographs would then allow for these prominent people to be blackmailed, even if they themselves had never committed a criminal act against children. Chris Moore, newly employed journalist at the BBC during the Kincora Scandal, explained in an article published at the Broken Elbow that within months I would become embedded with a story that led me into my first ever long-term investigation. It was January 24th, 1980, when Irish Independent reporter, the late Peter McKenna, hit the front page with a story about an unidentified boys' home in East Belfast, where boys in care were being sexually abused. It took only a few phone calls to establish the home in question was the Kincora Working Boys Hostel at 236 Upper Newtownards Road in Belfast. And it wasn't long before I was totally absorbed in a story that for the past 40 years has continued to mystify and horrify in equal measures the attention of the Northern Ireland public. Peter McKenna's story led to a police investigation that resulted in the trial of the 3 male care staff at Kincora, along with 3 others the police discovered as child sex abusers at other state-run homes for underage and underprivileged children. All 6 were convicted. The 3 jailed Kincora staff were Warden Joe Mains, who got 6 years, his deputy Raymond Simple, 5 years, and house father William McGrath, who received a 4-year prison sentence. It was after they were convicted in December 1981 that the legal constraints of the trial were removed, and the center of the political intrigue that followed was identified as William McGrath. This Bible-thumping evangelical pedophile bigot was preaching the gospel of fear, predicting in the 70s that there would be blood on the streets of Northern Ireland during a Republican uprising. He boasted to his followers in the paramilitary group he set up, Tara, that he based his claims, which turned out to be true, on information he received from British intelligence sources. He established his own Orange Lodge, which stood out from all the others because of McGrath's sense of Irishness, which allowed him to put a Gaelic inscription on the lodge's banner. I had good sources in the RUC team investigating Kincora, and two of them informed me that McGrath's claims about getting information from British intelligence were true because he was their agent. In late-night meetings in deserted car parks, I was told that my stories were ruffling feathers in London more than in Northern Ireland. So what was so sensitive about the Kincora hostel that MI5 were prepared to use their unique position to manipulate the British government into covering up their true role in Kincora? I don't know for sure what lies behind the government hiding official state papers until 2065 in one case, and in another, to 2085. I have seen secret state papers dated back to the 1982-1983 period of discussion about setting up the public inquiry under retired Judge William Hughes. In those papers, the MI5 legal advisor urges the government not to give a full public inquiry under the 1921 Act, as its powers to compel documents and personnel in MI5 would lead to embarrassing disclosures about how MI5 was involved in an operation to spy on Protestant political leaders that linked to Kincora. Judge Hughes is therefore nobbled into confining his terms of reference, TOR, for looking at the social care failings, which is exactly what he did. But whatever secrets MI5 and the British government are preventing us from knowing about, even to this day, ensure that their secrecy adds to the public perception that fans the flames of a complete lack of trust in the government and MI5 to be totally open and accountable. Kincora has become Britain's unwanted child. My efforts to report it on the BBC led to a variety of strange occurrences that made me more aware that the BBC was not immune from political pressures. There was among some of us within the BBC a regular concern about government presence in the corporation and interference in the way the BBC interpreted freedom of speech. It was well known, for instance, that BBC recruitment regularly accepted university graduates that had already been recruited elsewhere into Britain's secret services. Looking back to my endeavors in the early 80s to get to the truth of Kincora leads me to recall a story provided to me by a police officer's source. Let's call him David, to preserve his anonymity. In 1975, yes, 5 years before the Kincora story emerged, David was investigating allegations of child sex abuse involving a 15-year-old boy in care at a home in Newtownards. I'd been referred to the police officer by the social worker who had called in the police after the boy alleged a relative had sexually abused him and taken him to other men to engage in sex. The boy was in care because his parents were separated and living in England. David's inquiries led him to Kincora. He began to watch Kincora. He built up a profile of people coming and going at Kincora who had no legitimate business in going into the building. He told me he took photographs of individuals, captured car registrations, and identified the owners. Among those he says he positively identified were justices of the peace, 2 police officers, businessmen, and 2 Englishmen who were officials from the Northern Ireland office based at Stormont. I tracked down the boy through his father, whom I visited at his London home. His father told me, when his son first made his allegations, the father returned to Belfast to speak to police. He told how the police showed him what he called pretty innocent photographs of his son. But he told me he was also shown another photograph which showed his son involved in homosexual acts with other men and with other boys. When I arrived in Lancashire, not far from Liverpool, the boy, now a man in his early 20s, was expecting me. We chatted, and he agreed to be interviewed in silhouette. We did the interview, and he admitted being used by a relative to provide sexual favors for between 6 and 10 men. I'd shown him a copy of the Irish Independent and the Irish Times, in which there was a reference to a prostitution ring. What did he make of that? He told me he knew his relative ran one and took him to these other men to have sex with them. I returned to Belfast with my filmed interview with a young man describing his rape and sexual abuse orchestrated by a relative. We ran his story on BBC News and in a BBC Spotlight program around February 11th, 1982. This was a headline-catching story. Next day, Northern Ireland Complaints Commissioner Stephen McGonigal called me to say 3 of his panel of 5 on the private inquiry set up by Secretary of State James Pryor had resigned after seeing the interview with the man in Lancashire. So that ended that inquiry. They said they felt that the RUC had failed to carry out an effective investigation. Back in 1975, David had been ordered to drop his Kincora investigations, and his appeal for more manpower to expand his investigation was rejected. He was ordered to prosecute only the relative, a man called William Billy Baird, who was subsequently convicted on May 18, 1976, on 3 counts of buggery and 1 of gross indecency. But now, there was a developing possibility that through me and the BBC, his story could be aired. But then a strange thing happened. David stopped taking my calls. No mobile phones in those days, so contact was dependent on landline telephones. Eventually, I persuaded my source to meet me outside a station at our usual meeting place on the Lisburn Road in Belfast. What he told me at that meeting left me stunned, angry, and feeling in some way betrayed and isolated. David said I had let him down. David had been spoken to firmly by his bosses. They knew he was my source for stories that had been publicized in my reports on BBC. What was going on? How did they know? The answer to that was the cause of my discomfort. David said he had been hauled over the coals because one of my superiors in the BBC had allegedly informed an assistant chief constable that David was my source and had identified him by name. If David was correct, in my first ever investigative story, I had been betrayed by someone within my place of work and who had also betrayed the principle of source protection adopted by journalists. I learned a painful lesson about trust. I thought I knew who had given up my source, but never confronted that individual. Understandably, David severed all communication with me. With his disappearance from my life went all the material he had gathered and which he had said he might hand over to me some day, as it was obviously extremely relevant to Kincora. So if the aim was to kill off any prospect of a Kincora story emerging, it was now gone, dead in the water, as they say. Somehow, someone had managed to close down this potentially harmful information about Kincora. The photographs, the identities of male visitors with unaccountable reasons for their attendance, the justices of the peace and the businessmen and the Englishmen who worked as civil servants at the Northern Ireland office based in Stormont. I tracked David down in 2014 and asked him what had become of his Kincora material. Destroyed when I left service, he told me. But when I look back at his disclosures to me and to what happened to end our connection, I am bamboozled in the manner of the ending of our contact, but now I am wondering if the closing down of his case and the closing down of our connection actually served MI5's and the British government's desire to dampen interest in Kincora. They closed him down and effectively silenced me and the BBC from developing that line of Kincora inquiry. Why? But here's something relevant I need to tell you. When, in January 1980, the Kincora story made headlines, RUC invited any officers who had been involved in any child sex investigation to meet with the Kincora investigation team at NOC HQ in Belfast. David went along and gave details of his investigation and the outcome. He fully expected to be seconded on the Kincora investigation. He never heard another word about it. And that is very strange. I mean, what was it that attracted David to Kincora? Didn't the police think it was worth pursuing an answer to that question? No, apparently not. The recent pathetic latest attempt by the British to keep MI5's Kincora secret was the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry, HIA, under the chairmanship of the late retired Judge Anthony Hart. Detective George Clark, in his statement to the HIA, reflected on the Billy Baird case when he stated, "It is noted that the boy who was the source subject of this spotlight program and in respect of whose abuse prosecution had previously been directed, was never a resident at Kincora and had no links to Kincora at all. No further charges were brought as a result of this investigation." This was related to my interview with the relative of the late Billy Baird, who spoke of being taken to between 6 and 10 other men by Billy Baird for the purposes of having sex with them. He told me about going to public toilets at Ward Park in Bangor, and how Billy Baird would use his headlights or windscreen wipers as a means of signaling other men as to his presence there with a young boy, or how he would be taken to a bar in East Belfast for sex sessions with other men. David told me about these venues and said he had checked them out and found out that the boy was correct. As I said, it was his first interview, and our broadcast was the first to cover his story. Detective George Caskey personally heard this interview, and he knew the boy told me about being taken to between 6 to 10 men for sex. I know this because when he interviewed me about it, Mr. Caskey was able to read out details of the interview from a transcript he had held in his hand. I wrote up the notes and typed out a statement from Mr. Caskey, and I have copies to hand. Yet the police evidence to the HIA inquiry states that the subject of this story was never a resident at Kincora. So what? What is staggering is that in the weeks immediately after Kincora is publicly identified as a place of abuse for young boys in public care, a police team set up to investigate Kincora is approached by a detective who found himself being led to Kincora in another child sex abuse case. He was way ahead of them. He had been watching Kincora and had gathered vital information such as car registrations and the identities of men coming and going at the hostel. Surely useful information. But no, the boy was not a resident of Kincora, so just leave it at that. The question that should have been asked is what was it that led David to Kincora? What leads had he followed? So then the police tell the HIA inquiry that because the relative of Billy Baird was never a resident at Kincora, no further charges were brought. Totally irrelevant that he was not a resident at Kincora. A police detective, David, told the team set up to investigate Kincora about how he'd been drawn to the East Belfast home when investigating allegations that a 15-year-old schoolboy was being sexually abused by a male relative. That should at least have raised an interest. Coincidence or a timely lead to follow up? I do not know why David ended up there. He never told me. Did the police ever ask him when he turned up at headquarters armed with all the information? What did he say? Because the survivor of a relative's abuse had not been a resident at Kincora, the police appeared to just rule it out and disregard it. Who ordered that David's investigation should be closed down? And why was it closed down? Did anyone ask? Had the police investigated thoroughly, they might have discovered potential links between Billy Baird and William McGrath. Both were homosexual pedophiles. Both were in the Orange Order. Did they know one another, either through the illegal and secretive homosexual community, or through their interest in sex with boys, or even perhaps through the Orange Order, or all three? Is that not how pedophile rings work? Surely it was worth finding out why David's investigation of Billy Baird led him to conduct surveillance on Kincora 5 years before Kincora first came to public attention. And did that original 1980 police inquiry bother to check up on the names David had gathered? If so, what was found? Or did no one in the 1980 police investigation bother to follow up on what David had discovered 5 years earlier about Kincora? Did the 1980 police investigation report on why David was told to drop his investigation as it related to the boys' home? Operation Clockwork Orange was a secret British security services project alleged to have involved a right-wing smear campaign against British politicians from 1974 to 1975. Black propaganda led British Prime Minister Harold Wilson to fear that the security services were preparing a coup d'etat. The project was undertaken by members of the British intelligence services and the British Army Press Office in Northern Ireland, whose job also included routine public relations work and placing disinformation stories in the press as part of a psychological warfare operation. One of the project's members, Colin Wallace, who was the press officer at the Army headquarters in Northern Ireland, also claims that in 1973, after MI5 became the primary intelligence service in Northern Ireland, the project began giving briefings to foreign journalists against members of Wilson's government. These briefings included distributing forged documents in an attempt to show that the subjects of the briefings were communists or Irish Republican sympathizers leading a campaign to destabilize Northern Ireland. After his resignation, Wilson claimed that he was the target of a planned military coup. He also denounced a campaign to smear him staged by members of MI5 in order to force his resignation. Journalist Barry Penrose describes how Wilson spoke darkly of 2 military coups, which he said had been planned to overthrow his government in the late 1960s and in the mid-1970s. According to author David Burke in Chapter 8 of his book Operation Clockwork Orange, on 7th of July 1980, Jeff Edwards of London's Evening News revealed the Metropolitan Police had passed files to the Director of Public Prosecutions. 12 men faced up to 350 sexual offenses, including allegations that they had obtained young boys for politicians, prominent lawyers, and film stars. The youngest victim was 6 years of age. A few days later, Edwards was summoned by the police to an interview and threatened with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. Mysteriously, the prosecution of the 12 men did not proceed. Edwards' source, a serving Metropolitan Police officer, was disciplined and fined for leaking the story. It is believed that the then Home Secretary and de facto Deputy Prime Minister William Whitelaw ordered a senior Metropolitan Police officer to quash the investigation. William Whitelaw was the political master of MI5 at this time and must have acted in concert with them in quashing the prosecution. Whitelaw was very close to the intelligence services. He had served as Northern Ireland's Secretary of State in Belfast, 1972 to 73, where he had worked cheek by jowl with them. MI5 and MI6 worked in the same building as him, Stormont Castle. He spent much of his time drinking late into the night with Alan Rowley of MI6, the first DCI after the introduction of direct rule. Frederick Allen Rowley was the first director and coordinator of intelligence at the Northern Ireland office following its establishment in 1972, and the only one drawn from MI6. Whitelaw used MI6 to arrange face-to-face truce negotiations with the IRA in 1972. It is inconceivable that DCI Rowley did not know all about the Kincora operation. The odds are high that Whitelaw learnt about it as a component of Operation Clockwork Orange, too, as he was central to the Sunningdale negotiations and was in receipt of frequent briefings from Rowley about the opposition to the power-sharing executive by Loyalists. Whitelaw left Northern Ireland in December 1973, shortly after the agreement was signed. Whitelaw's deputy in 72 to 73 was William Van Straubens, MP. It has since emerged that he was a pedophile. In the early 1970s, the orphans and abandoned children at Kincora, Williamson House, and Bonmore stood no chance of rescue from their sexual enslavement with the likes of prolific pedophile Ted Heath as Prime Minister, Whitelaw, a protector of abusers, as Northern Ireland's Secretary, and Van Straubens as his deputy, aided and abetted by MI5 and MI6. Two of the most senior NIO officers in the 1970s, Peter England and John Emery, were abusers too. Peter England abused boys ensnared by the pedophile ring that MI5 and MI6 was protecting. One of them described his ordeal to the BBC. Peter England had a conviction for exposing himself in a toilet in London, as did John Emery. A lot of very powerful people had, and continue to have, a vested interest in concealing the truth about Kincora. Colin Wallace was about to walk into the lion's den. In January 1980, 3 members of the staff at Kincora, William McGrath, Joe Mains, and Raymond Semple, were suspended after the Irish Independent exposed the abuse at Kincora on the front page of the newspaper on January 24, 1980. Mains, McGrath, and Semple were charged on the 3rd of April, 1980. Wallace was unaware of the Kincora shockwaves that were reverberating around Northern Ireland, as he had taken up residence in England after his dismissal from the British Army in 1975. He did not become aware of the development until February 1982, when he was named in Parliament by Jerry Fitt as someone with information about the scandal. In March 1980, David McKittrick, a northern editor of the Irish Times, contacted Wallace. He was one of those who knew about McGrath. British Army intelligence operative told me in 1975 that William McGrath, one of the figures in the Kincora Boys' Home case, was a homosexual. He and other sources also told me that McGrath was the head of Tara, a shadowy extreme loyalist organization. My information came from Colin Wallace, who was at that time Chief Civilian Press Officer at Army Headquarters in Lisburn, and who had links with military intelligence. My notes of a conversation with Wallace in Army Headquarters in 1975 showed that he said McGrath was head of Tara, an organization of evangelical Protestants which had called for the banning of the Catholic Church and for all education to be carried out by evangelical Protestants. He also gave me McGrath's East Belfast address and his telephone number. Wallace actually provided the information in 1974. When he contacted Wallace in March 1980, McKittrick said he wanted to come over to London to talk about the contents of a book written by Colonel Robin Eveleigh, who had served with the army in Northern Ireland. Wallace met him at the Washington Hotel in London. McKittrick did not mention Tara or Kincora. McGrath, Mains, and Semple were charged on April 3, 1980. McKittrick called Wallace again in early April and said that he wanted to come back to meet him for a further discussion on the Eveleigh material. During the April 1980 discussion, Wallace provided McKittrick with some information about intelligence rivalries in Northern Ireland and the plotting against Harold Wilson in the 1970s, which McKittrick included in an article on British intelligence in the Irish Times on April 22nd. It would not have been difficult for MI5 to have figured out that Wallace was one of McKittrick's sources. They routinely tapped journalists' phones and had access to flight records. They now knew Wallace was prepared to talk to the media about intelligence matters, including the anti-Wilson plotting. In their eyes, Wallace stood as a lethal threat to their reputation, especially as suspicion about an intelligence dimension to Kincora was gaining traction with the press. Wallace could talk to a journalist about Kincora at any given moment. The worst-case scenario was that one of the journalists who knew about the 1973 Tara press briefing would contact him about the Kincora scandal. Unfortunately for Wallace, MI5 was now commanded by 2 individuals who were as ruthless as any of their predecessors: Howard Smith, the Director General of MI5 1978-81, and his deputy, John Jones. And according to author David Burke, space does not permit a thorough review of Howard Smith's career. For present purposes, it is worth noting that in the 1960s, while in the Foreign Office, he had recommended the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the Prime Minister of the Congo, to the British government. Ted Heath was a minister at the department at the time and on the distribution list of Smith's assassination recommendation. Lumumba was murdered in 1961 in a joint CIA-MI6 plot. Smith spent most of 1971 and some of 1972 as the British government's envoy, or UK rep, to Northern Ireland, and was undoubtedly aware of what had taken place at Kincora. His neck was now on the line in a very real way. As luck would have it, his political boss in 1980 was William Whitelaw, the Home Secretary, whom he knew well from Belfast, where the pair had worked together during 1972. Smith was the first man Whitelaw met in Northern Ireland as Secretary of State. Smith had collected Whitelaw from the airport on his first trip in his new proconsular capacity. Whitelaw is an overlooked figure in the Kincora Scandal. Thatcher appreciated his ability to fix difficult problems. He was her minister for banana skins. "Every prime minister needs a Willie," she once said. Whitelaw's main task was to scan the political horizon for problems that could blow up into crises and recommend early action to avoid them. He had developed this skill as Tory chief whip in the 1960s when he had exploited the whip's dirt book to blackmail MPs who were refusing to toe the party line. Some of those in the dossier were pedophile MPs. Is it likely that MI5 withheld their strategy for dealing with Kincora from Whitelaw? John Jack Jones was the man who took care of MI5's dirty work at this time. Jones undoubtedly knew about the various compromat operations in Northern Ireland. They had been conducted in the early 1970s, while he had been stationed there. Jones and Peter Wright were probably responsible for the surveillance of the Clockwork Orange pedophiles, including the bugging of the bedrooms in the Park Avenue Hotel in Belfast, where Joe Mains and John McKeague lured surveillance targets to bedrooms where they had sent boys. Wallace might have been murdered by one of the loyalist assassins at MI5's beck and call, such as John McKeague, but for an opportunity that arose, apparently out of the blue, to demolish his credibility. Jonathan Lewis, one of his friends, went missing on August 5, 1980. His body was recovered from the River Arun 3 days later. Wallace had nothing to do with the death of Lewis, yet he ended up on trial for it. Dirty tricks were used to secure his conviction. When Lewis's body was found in the Arun, his skull was damaged. At least some, if not all, of the injuries were inflicted by the propeller of a boat, which had become entangled with the corpse. Dr. Ian West, the Home Office pathologist, performed the initial post-mortem on 8th of August and failed to detect anything untoward. Post-mortem reported no foul play suspected. On August 12th, Dr. Ian West changed his mind. He now discovered an injury to Lewis's nose, which he had apparently missed. On September 18th, whistleblower Colin Wallace was charged with murder by the Sussex police. His trial opened on the 3rd of March 1981. The key piece of evidence against Wallace was provided by Dr. Ian West. He now alleged that the blow which had killed Lewis had been administered by a martial arts technique Wallace had learned as a part of his military training. West later confessed that an American security source had fed the notion to him, yet in court he presented it to the jury as if he had expert knowledge of the topic. MI5 is a department of the Home Office, the same parent body which employed West. In 1980, shortly after the Kincora story appeared in the press, Colin Wallace was arrested and wrongly convicted for manslaughter of the husband of one of his colleagues, for which he spent 6 years in prison until 1987. It was reported that Wallace had beaten antique dealer Jonathan Lewis to death before attending a dinner party with the dead man's wife. Later that night, Wallace was alleged to have dumped the body in the River Arun. In 1996, The conviction was quashed in the light of new forensic and other evidence that raised serious questions about the dubious nature of the evidence used to convict Wallace initially. The Court of Appeal heard that scientific evidence used to convict Wallace was false, and that the Home Office pathologist involved in the case admitted that he had received it from an anonymous American security source. Journalist and author Paul Foote suggested in his book that Wallace may have been framed for the killing, possibly by renegade members of the security services, in a bid to discredit his allegations about the Kincora Scandal and the fact that members of the intelligence community had attempted to rig the 1974 general election after which Harold Wilson came to power with a minority government. Colin Wallace has since been dubbed the man who knew too much. Journalist Joseph de Burca describes the Anglo-Irish vice ring as an utterly depraved and debauched collection of perverts, sadists, and child molesters, some of whom even abused their own children. The ring included powerful establishment figures from Westminster, such as Sir Knox Cunningham, MP, Sir Cyril Smith, MP, British civil servants, MI5 and MI6 officers, and even members of the aristocracy such as Lord Louis Mountbatten, close relative of the British royal family and close friend of the sadistic necrophiliac and child rapist Jimmy Savile. According to the book, written by investigative journalist and author David Burke, The Mountbatten Dossier, the FBI began compiling its Mountbatten dossier in February 1944, shortly after Mountbatten became Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia. The FBI interviewed Elizabeth de la Poer Beresford, Baroness Decius. According to the FBI file, she states that in these circles, Lord Louis Mountbatten and his wife are considered persons of extremely low morals. Also that he was known to be a homosexual with a perversion for young boys. Her opinion of him was that he was an unfit man to direct any sort of military operations because of this condition. She stated further that his wife, Lady Mountbatten, was considered equally erratic. The Americans maintained their observation of Mountbatten after World War II, especially after he became NATO commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, then Admiral of the Fleet, and later Chief of the Defense Staff. Norman Neild, a naval rating, was Mountbatten's personal driver between 1942 and 43. At the time, Mountbatten was living in a large house at Fareham, Hampshire, near Portsmouth. According to Neild, Mountbatten was a boy lover and a sexual deviant who preyed on young boys to fulfill his bizarre sexual fantasies. Mountbatten used brandy and lemonade to help seduce his young victims, Neild claimed. Alfred Arnold was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland's aide and the pedophile who set up the Anglo-Irish Vice Ring, AIVR, of which Lord Mountbatten was the highest-born member. According to Burke, the architect of the AIVR was Alfred Arnold. He served as private secretary to Sir Basil Brooke, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland from 43 to 63. While child abuse among the aristocracy has been going on for centuries, it was Arnold who turned the abuse into a system which transformed care homes run by the Stormont government into places from which children could be taken and raped. Pedophiles, adults who sexually abuse children, and pederasts, adults who sexually abuse adolescent boys, were assigned to run them and supply children to the Anglo-Irish vice ring. Another of Mountbatten's friends was Captain Peter Montgomery, a cousin of Monty, the famous World War II field marshal. The captain lived at a magnificent estate in Blessingbourne, County Tyrone. Montgomery later became Deputy Lord Lieutenant of Tyrone, which meant he was one of an elite number of personal representatives of the Queen in Ulster. He also became president of the Northern Ireland Arts Council. Montgomery let William McGrath, the housefather of Kincora, use Blessingbourne to train members of Tara, the loyalist paramilitary organization McGrath commanded. According to author and Kincora whistleblower Robin Bryans, who tried to expose the Anglo-Irish vice ring of which Kincora was a part in the 1970s, he knew Montgomery well. and claimed the latter procured boys for Portora Royal College for those in the vice ring with a penchant for well-bred children. Peter Montgomery also had access to boys at Williamson House in Belfast. Eric Witchell, another member of the vice ring, was in charge of Williamson House. Witchell is alive and living in London. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse failed to interview Witchell. The boys from Williamson House were brutalized and transformed into sexual playthings for the vice ring. Anal rape commenced at the home when the boys, orphans, and abandoned underprivileged children were as young as 6. A number of these victims later committed suicide. Before we transition into the final chapter of our story, it's important to note the extraordinary connections that one Roy Cohn happens to share with abuses at Kincora and the Anglo-Irish vice ring. Village magazine published an article July 4th, 2020 with the title, Trump's Mentor, Another Sociopathic Pedophile Child Trafficker in the Mix, from Roy Cohn to Epstein and Maxwell. The introduction begins by describing how law enforcement agencies on both sides of the Atlantic have been, and continue to be, adverse to making inquiries into VIP child sex abuse. This has been the position for decades. Donald Trump's mentor, Roy Cohn, was a pedophile who abused boys on both sides of the Atlantic, including one from Kincora Boys' Home, Richard Kerr, whom he selected in Belfast and had taken to him in Venice for sexual abuse. The article further explains that Cohn was a pedophile with connections to the Anglo-Irish vice ring in London. The link to it may have come through a Texan living in London called Fred Ferguson, who was also a pedophile, or Dr. Maurice Fraser, a Northern Ireland psychiatrist who was a key figure in the network. In any event, in 1977, he and Ferguson were able to gain access to a boy from Northern Ireland through the network. The boy was part of a group of 14-year-old boys who had been residents of Williamson House in Belfast until they were transferred to Kincora Boys' Home in 1975. Some, if not all, of the Williamson boys had been subjected to horrific abuse, violence, and intimidation by one of the staff at the home, Eric Witchell, and his associates from outside of it, so much so they had become fearful and compliant child sex puppets. Witchell now lives in London. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, IICSA, has shown no interest in making any form of contact with him, despite his key role in the Anglo-Irish vice ring, a pedophile network that, as this story will demonstrate, overlapped with abuse rings in the U.S. Village magazine has published an 80,000-word online book entitled The Anglo-Irish Vice Ring, which outlines the history of the Irish branch of this egregious pedophile underworld, as well as its connections to and exploitation by MI6, attached to Britain's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and MI5, attached to Britain's Home Office. The abuse of the children at Williamson House, Kincora, and elsewhere in Northern Ireland was carried out with the knowledge and connivance of both MI5 and MI6. At the time of the transfer of the boys from Williamson House to Kincora, MI5 was the dominant UK intelligence service operating in Northern Ireland. It was commanded by Director General Sir Michael Hanley. His key officer on the ground in Northern Ireland was Ian Cameron, who was mooted in the media as a contender for the position of Director General of MI5 in the late 1980s. One of the boys transferred to Kincora, Richard Kerr, was transferred in August of 1975. Another boy, Stephen Waring, who had not been in Williamson House, joined a few months later. He committed suicide in November 1977 after being abused by Lord Louis Mountbatten the previous August. The boy abused by Cohn, Richard Kerr, was the first of the children from Williamson House to arrive at Kincora. On the surface, there was no logical reason for the transfer of the new residents. Cameron and MI5, however, were the beneficiaries of the new arrangement because it allowed them to replenish their ongoing honey trap blackmail operations in Belfast, Bangor, and elsewhere with a fresh batch of younger teenagers who were broken, terrified, and sexually compliant. In addition, MI5 was in complete control of Kincora, a detached house at a crossroads with a side entrance. The building was also smaller and more manageable than Williamson House, which consisted of two structures. It was located conveniently close to a number of venues which were frequented by loyalist terrorist groups, at least one of which, the Park Avenue Hotel, had an MI5, MI6 operations room to record what was taking place in the bedrooms. One very senior DUP figure was caught on tape in one of the rooms. He is still alive and an influence on the party. More important than any of this, Kincora was controlled by three men, all of whom were pedophiles: Joe Maines, William McGrath, and Raymond Simple. In comparison, Witchell is the only pedophile who we can say with certainty was employed at Williamson House at that point in time. Witchell did, however, let other pedophiles into the home to abuse the vulnerable children in his care. After the transfer of this helpless group of boys to Kincora in 1975, MI5 was in a position to move them about at will. Sickeningly, intelligence figures at the Northern Ireland office, such as Peter England and John Emery, were able to exploit the boys as a nasty perk of their job. Members of this victim group were trafficked to England and Scotland by Maines on the orders of Jos Cardwell, an influential loyalist politician and friend of senior MPs at Westminster, such as the leader of the official Unionist Party, James Molyneux, MP. One of those who had access to boys from Kincora in London was a high-profile MP and a friend of Molyneux. Another abuser was a famous actor in light entertainment who was still very much to the fore of his profession. Not only are both of these men alive, one of them has a long history of involvement in children's charities. The IICSA has been curiously apathetic about them. Even at this late stage, Richard Kerr, who was abused by both, was prepared to tell them what he knows. In 1977, Richard Kerr was driven by Joe Maines, the warden of Kincora, and Raymond Simple, a member of the staff at Kincora, to the Whip and Saddle bar at the Europa Hotel in Belfast. Kerr was familiar with the Europa, where he had been abused since he was 14 years of age. One of his abusers at the hotel was Enoch Powell, MP. On this particular occasion, Kerr was introduced to some Americans in the bar. One of them did not give his correct name, but was in fact Roy Cohn, perhaps the most famous U.S. lawyer of the second half of the 20th century and the mentor of young Donald Trump. He was there with two other Americans, Fred Ferguson and Daniel S. Daniel S.'s father owned a company in Wichita Falls, Texas, which supplied parts to the oil industry. The encounter at the Europa has all the appearances of a sleazy appraisal by Cohn and Ferguson to see if the young Irish teenager whetted their sexual appetites. He was 15, or perhaps had just turned 16, having been born in May 1961. The plan for Cohn and Ferguson at this time was to visit Venice 2 weeks later, and they sought a compliant teenage boy for sex. Kerr clearly passed the test, and arrangements were made for him to join them and Daniel S. on their trip. 2 weeks later, Maines ordered Kerr to take a ferry to Liverpool, presumably on the Ulster Monarch, where Ferguson and Daniel S. were waiting for him. They took a train to London. Ferguson left Kerr with Daniel S., who took him to the Bonaparte restaurant at the Napoleon Club on Lancashire Place in London. Kerr was kept in London overnight, or perhaps 2 nights at a guest house. The traffickers were now joined by 2 vice-ring enforcers, Mike Anderson from Manchester and Stephen Jackson. Ferguson rejoined the group, which ultimately consisted of Kerr, Ferguson, Daniel S., Anderson, and Jackson. They headed to the coast by train, presumably to Dover, from where it crossed the Channel by ship. After that, I was put on another train, and we went through Europe, and I ended up in Venice. despite the fact the trafficking of Kerr across Britain and Europe and back again involved 4 adult males. Judge Hart denied the existence of a vice ring of any sort in his execrable 2017 report on Kincora. Cohn was waiting for Kerr in Venice at the world-renowned Greedy Palace Hotel at a glass table. Richard Kerr was struck by the marble floor and majestic pillars close to the ballroom. Cohn didn't talk too much and just took me up to the room and we had an encounter. He learned his correct name later. I believed that I was there 3 or 4 days. Ferguson also abused Kerr in Venice. It's safe to say we have barely even scratched the surface of this complicated story, with so many additional layers yet to be peeled back and exposed to the public, including the significant influence of the Orange Order, a Protestant fraternal order and secret society based in Northern Ireland, with deep ties to the Black Preceptory, or Royal Black Institution, and the Freemasonic Brotherhood. In fact, journalist Michael Sarian mentions in an article titled The Occult History of Ireland that in Northern Ireland's 1920 constitution, Freemasonry was even awarded special status, as if in recognition of some concealed role in the province's triumphant struggle to stay in the United Kingdom and out of the Irish Free State. He even suggests that the 2 founders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which would essentially become the IRA, and the leader of the Fenian Brotherhood, were not true revolutionaries interested in the freedom of Ireland, but were potentially part of a plot devised by the Alpha Lodges of British Freemasonry and executed by British intelligence. The Crown-controlled Brotherhood had the power not only to send trained agents to infiltrate legitimate Irish patriot groups, but to create groups which appeared legitimate but were anything but. Sarian also writes about their festival day, which happens to fall on July 13th, a day sacred to Antinous sun worshippers. This Setian-Antinous drama has been played out on the stage of Ireland's politics for centuries. Order out of chaos, then back to chaos again, on and on ad nauseum. Our final chapter is dedicated to Brian McDermott, who was a 10-year-old schoolboy that disappeared in Belfast in 1973. He was last seen at Ormeau Park on September 2nd, 1973. A week after he went missing, the River Lagan was lowered and a sack containing some of his remains was found. Brian's murder remains unsolved. In 1982, a possible link between the death of Brian McDermott and the abuse scandal at Kincora Boys' Home was discussed by Jim Pryor, Michael Havers, senior civil servant Sir William Bourne, and Quentin Hogg, who at the time was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and the Lord Chancellor. Papers concerning this meeting were released in 2013. Brian's brother William was 16 at the time of his disappearance. He was considered a suspect and questioned in 1976 and again in 2004. William denies the allegations and claims that his 1976 confession was coerced. December 27, 2013, the BBC ran an article reporting on the newly released documents. The article briefly mentions that, according to the minutes, the RUC was investigating allegations that a DHSS file on Kincora had been mutilated in 1977. The Attorney General also told his colleagues the RUC were looking again at the murder of Brian McDermott in the mid-1970s, whose death was thought at the time to have been sectarian, but it was now believed possible that there were homosexual aspects. This was a reference to the unsolved 1973 murder of a 10-year-old East Belfast schoolboy Brian McDermott, whose mutilated and burnt body had been found in a sack in the River Lagan at Ormeau Park. At the time, the press reported fears that a psychopathic killer was at large. The DPP believed that these inquiries were unlikely to lead to prosecutions, that this new information conflicted with what the RUC had previously told ministers and left the government in an embarrassing and exposed position. To his credit, David Burke in the Mountbatten dossier perfectly explains the ugly truth behind this brutal child murder. According to Burke, the Kincora Scandal involves layer upon layer of interwoven criminality and wrongdoing. Children were sexually abused by the Anglo-Irish vice ring, some as young as 6 years of age. Some of the abusers were blackmailed by MI5 and MI6, a crime in its own right. MI5 and MI6 collected compromat about loyalist politicians such as James Molyneux, the leader of the Unionist Party. A senior figure in the DUP was recorded with a boy in a bedroom at the Park Avenue Hotel in Belfast. William McGrath was a leading Orange man and a friend of Jim Molyneux, MP, and member of the Monday Club. Loyalist serial killers such as John McKeague were recruited to murder MI5 RUC targets. These murders were covered up on both sides of the border. Future Garda Commissioner Larry Wren failed to investigate the murder of Seamus Ludlow in the Republic of Ireland properly in a full and proper manner. Ludlow was shot by McKeague's Red Hand Commando. The course of justice was perverted by the RUC, MI5, MI6, the NIO, Whitehall, and the Wren faction of the Garda. Deliberate fraud was committed by Sir George Terry, author of the 1982 Terry Report about Kincora. Terry was chief constable of the Sussex Police. Victims of the abuse were vilified and continued to be vilified as liars and fantasists by elements of the British media. The British media suppressed evidence in its possession about the scandal. One of the most high-profile political broadcasters on British TV withdrew a story from a newspaper he edited. It featured an interview with a British Army general which exposed elements of the scandal. Some victims were driven to suicide, others to a life in prostitution. As a sick perk of their job, certain NIO and MI5 officials, including Peter England and John Emery, abused children in the grip of the network. Alan Campbell, the chief suspect in the abduction, murder, and dismemberment of Brian McDermott, 10 years old, was protected by MI5 and the RUC. Alan Campbell is the chief suspect in the murder of Brian McDermott. The RUC believed John McKeague and Campbell were involved in the abduction and rape of boys in Northern Ireland. One of the key figures in the pedophile gang which revolved around Kincora was John McKeague. MI5 admitted at the Hart inquiry that it had compromising film of him and considered recruiting him as an agent, but in the end decided against it. They were undoubtedly lying. McKeague became one of their agents. Alan Campbell was a member of the gang which abused the boys at Kincora and elsewhere. The information about Campbell relates to the murder of Brian McDermott. It has been suppressed by the BBC since May 2021. Alan Campbell was a friend of John McKeague, the sadistic and murderous leader of the Red Hand Commando. Both men were key figures in the Scankle Defense Association, SDA. Both were associates of Ian Paisley, who set up the DUP. McKeague once served as Paisley's bodyguard. Like Maines, McGrath, and McKeague, Alan Campbell was undoubtedly an MI5 agent. RUC officers were about to arrest Alan Campbell for the murder of Brian McDermott when a force more powerful than the police stepped in and stayed their hand. Campbell was never charged. Authors Jim Cusack and Henry MacDonald have stated that he was a British agent. They described him as the demon preacher. Campbell was the chief suspect in the kidnap and murder of Brian McDermott in '73. Part of his headless corpse was discovered, partly charred, in a bag in the River Lagan. 4 other boys disappeared, never to be found. Jonathan Avon, 14, 20th of September 1969. David Leckie, 12, September 25th, 1969. Thomas Spence, 11, 26th of November 74. John Rogers, 13, 26th of November 74. The RUC officers who investigated the McDermott murder were about to arrest Campbell for it. They informed British military intelligence at Lisburn of their intention. The army was interested in Campbell because he was in Tara, the loyalist paramilitary group commanded by McGrath. Suddenly, the RUC was ordered to leave Campbell alone. Only MI5 and the NIO have that sort of power. The evidence against Campbell was sufficiently substantial to form the basis for a criminal prosecution. Years later, the evidence was put aside while the RUC extracted a false confession from a relative of McDermott. Unless the attempt to frame the innocent man was designed to deflect attention away from Campbell, it is impossible to understand the behavior of the RUC in this instance. Campbell died in 2017, aged 67. It is not clear if the Campbell dossier was destroyed or not. Certainly some legal documents relating to Campbell disappeared, allegedly during a bomb explosion. John McKeague, bodyguard to Ian Paisley and one of the most important terrorists of the early Troubles, his bomb campaign toppled Captain Terence O'Neill as Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in 1969. He led the Red Hand Commando and was close to the UVF, especially Gusty Spence. He was also a pedophile and a friend of Alan Campbell. He was assassinated by British agents in the INLA in 1982 after he threatened to expose Kincora if he was arrested. If things weren't already strange enough, ex-Scotland Yard detective John Wedger and prominent advocate for child abuse victims and survivors, campaigning for the protection of whistleblowers, provides an additional layer to our story. He claims that after Brian McDermott had been missing for a week, individuals working the missing persons case within the RUC, Royal Ulster Constabulary, decided they were going to take this seriously, and they managed to lower the river level in the River Lagan. Now, whether they got intelligence, we don't know. That's not been disclosed. But what they find is a Hessian sack. They drag the sack out, and in it, they discover a mutilated body. The legs had been removed. They'd been cut off, butchered off. One of the arms had been removed, and the body had also been subject to partial incineration, so it was a charred corpse. It was badly burned and difficult to identify, but the body was that of a young boy, approximately 10 years old. Fingerprint from the remaining arm is used to get a print. The print of this young boy was then compared to a print from Brian's school book, and it came back that it was in fact Brian McDermott. So nothing else really happens on a policing level until 1976, when Brian's older brother William is accused of his murder. He's dragged in and subjected to hours and hours of nonstop interrogation, and subsequently signs a false confession, admitting to the murder of his brother. One theory which arose at the time was that the RUC had received information from various sources that Brian was abducted and murdered for witchcraft and satanic ritual purposes. This was considered to be the most serious theory circulating at the time. The RUC even went along with it, acknowledging they could be dealing with a witchcraft murder, until something strange happened. All of a sudden, a British government-sanctioned Army intelligence unit came into play, and they took a special interest in Brian McDermott's murder. Colin Wallace, military intelligence psychological operations officer, or the man who knew too much, he mentions Brian McDermott. He was then sanctioned for going around with his unit and setting up mock satanic ritual sites in and around Northern Ireland and the Donegal border. This unit would apparently go out, draw pentagrams everywhere. They would allegedly gather blood and pour it everywhere as they slaughtered sheep and laid them out in various locations. He claims he didn't know why they were doing this. Colin Wallace said he didn't even know what SRA was, satanic ritual abuse, but that they were told around the summer of 1973 to do this. They claimed that it stopped in the summer, but a leaked report showed that it went on until at least the winter. So that would cover the period when Brian McDermott went missing. Now, were they doing this to dismiss SRA as a reality? Or were they attempting to adulterate real satanic ritual abuse sites and then make a joke of it all? If they were pouring animal blood everywhere, and if there was any human blood, it would certainly affect any DNA on site for the required blood samples. It could be smoke screening. It seems very odd that they would do this, to say the least. Colin Wallace himself claims he doesn't know why he was sent to do it. But they went out, making up and defiling ritualistic sites all around Northern Ireland and the border. John Wedger also claims that one woman came to him with new information, and this information is now with the Garda, or the National Police and Security Service of Ireland. The information was obtained because a statement was made and given to the Garda. This comes from a person who is a survivor of ritualistic abuse, and states that in the early 1970s, her parents were Satanists, and this person would be used for satanic rituals, which is typically the way those who come from intergenerational ritualistic abuse are kept alive, and they use them to actually commit some of the murders on these children. Children are procured, whether from prostitutes within the coven, or they're abducted, and they are then used for deity worship, but also if someone requires something from the demon, and the demons will reward them, but only if paid in blood, and what they consider to be clean blood, which, according to former detective John Wedger, not only means the blood of a child, but before puberty. After puberty, it has no power. Before puberty, it holds the power. Within these satanic ranks, they're called the Watchers and the Fixers. The Watchers are lower ranking. They will identify the children, notify the Fixer, who will then abduct the child and arrange it for a ritual. Much of this is money-driven. There is a lot of money involved. The woman who gave her official statement to the Irish Security Services said that they were put into a dark room prior to the ritual, put on white clothing, and she recalls a young boy being brought into the room next to them. The boy was terrified. He'd been abducted. They had stripped him down and he'd wet his underpants. This person even described the young boy as having really skinny, knobbly knees, a very skinny little boy, which vaguely matches the description of Brian McDermott. She claimed that they were taken out onto the stage, and this young boy was put onto the altar. A white-haired man comes in, who is a prominent figure in British society, and the short, fat man goes up behind the young boy and cuts his throat. The boy falls to the floor bleeding. Then they smear the blood on their white robes, pick up the boy, and they do something. They cut off his left arm. The left arm is then held above the murderer's head, wearing all their Satanist regalia. They howl and start cheering as the arm is held up, and an orgy then takes place to conclude the ritual. The woman who gave this statement to Irish Security Services told former detective John Wedger, "I recognized the boy," because later his face was made public, and she's certain it was Brian McDermott. Brian McDermott's body was discovered incinerated inside a sack with his left arm missing, both legs cut off, and there were even unsubstantiated reports of genital mutilation, claiming that someone had actually bit the genital region off the young boy. If this is true, there might be even more substance to the claims that were made at the time that this was a sadistic act of witchcraft and ritualistic murder. Brian McDermott's murder remains unsolved to this day. As David Burke wrote, the Kincora Scandal is not going away. It is the cancer festering inside the heart of the British establishment. This week, we finally realize there is no real distinction between intelligence agencies such as the CIA or Mossad, MI5, MI6, British or French intelligence, and the shadow cabal of global elites hiding behind the curtain as puppet masters pulling the strings. These people don't recognize national borders. Generally speaking, in terms of American intelligence, it really is one whole perverse network that leads into the other. From royal families to secret societies paramilitary groups, and underground cult organizations. These entities perfectly embody the malignant cancer disrupting all of global society. There is a global intelligence apparatus operating as a private army with the only goal of enforcing the secret agenda of the international aristocracy. In our effort to peel back the disturbing layers of deceit intended to thoroughly disguise this alarmingly distinct modus operandi, we reluctantly reveal yet another dark and lurid tale of abuse and betrayal, invoking a haunting sense of déjà vu. Only this is no illusion of memory, but a terrifying vista of reality, and of our frightful position therein. Corrupt legal inquiries, covert psychological operations, state-run child brothels exploited for purposes of political blackmail, a UK Ministry of Defense program of psychological conditioning to create submissive boy soldiers, and mounting evidence tied to numerous allegations of satanic ritual abuse. The story of the Kincora Boys' Home shares all the hallmarks implicating this untouchable clandestine power structure hidden behind the shadowy veil and shrouded in mystery. In the end, I'm reminded again of what Ferdinand cried out as he leapt from the ship. Hell is empty, and all the devils are here.